Oh, I just took a swig of my honey and lemon.
We saw
Apologies.
you.
I was
We saw you.
grimacing then. I think I was losing my voice. I'm drinking honey and lemon and a bit too much lemon. Welcome to Media Snack live from New York.
Greetings from London.
Good. Thank you for joining us again. We've got a very good guest, another very good guest on today's show. Jerry Daykin, who many of you will know, is a articulately outspoken advocate of the media function, and has provided the industry actually over the years with some amazing assets of his own generosity. And Jerry seems to be involved in anything decent that's going on in this industry, frankly, which is great. So I don't know how he manages to do the day job as well, which he's good at, which we'll find out.
We're going to talk about that.
Which we'll talk about that. And there are lots of those of you that know Jerry, he touches lots of bits of the business in the industry. But we want to get him talking about media, and something which we've talked about a lot over the years and we've advocated for, which is just some basics media principles, like what is good basic media, and maybe Jerry can also help us cross that or erase that divide between what we've come to know as traditional media and digital media. I know he's got a kind of point of view on that. But this is important, I think, and it's a good time of year, right? Because I mean, what are typically advertisers doing at this time of year, David? Like you've been a client on the client side.
They're budgeting. They're budgeting and they're planning for next year. That's what they're doing.
Yeah. They're
counting the pennies.
So are they obsessing about the shiny new thing? No. Are they actually really thinking about media as an investment in growth?
That's
and
right.
Opportunity?
That's exactly what they're doing. Yeah.
Business metrics related to this investment. Yes. Let's ground ourselves in reality a little bit. Good. Okay. Let's
do it.
Hi guys.
Hi, Jerry.
How's it going?
Good. You've got is this a homage to the John Lewis ad and the Christmas ads, right?
I'm feeling suitably Christmas with a touch of GSK orange. It's maybe.
Very good.
Thanks for having me. I feel honoured to be here. I'm a long time listener, first time caller. I only started at GSK about 19 months ago. And when I first started, it was my first sort of technical media director role. I remember powering through about half a dozen media snack podcasts at the time, being like, what do I need to do? What am I meant to be asking? So here I am to give back. I don't know.
Yeah, it's full circle, and then it's just downhill from that point onwards. You can easily into retirement, having shared your wisdom. This is the pinnacle of it. I should point out as well, whilst you're on the wide screen, if those of you who don't know, if you follow Jerry on Twitter, you'll know this. Is Jerry as an obsessive Lego? What do you call it? Legoite? Lego.
There is some term for the adult who likes Lego, but I can't remember it. But it's a new habit of going through lockdown, and also I have this podium at the back. In the early days of lockdown, every day I tried to put something different on there to keep my calls fresh. Nowadays things last like 2 to 3 weeks, so that's my Halloween haunted house still going strong. But
very impressive.
It's good stuff. Good stuff.
Good.
Right. So we are, so first time guest. So thank you for joining us. As I said in the introduction, you are great at kind of sharing wisdom and insight across the business, and you give so generously kind of perspective. And I know that a lot of people find that hugely valuable. But you're also involved in a lot of initiatives across the business, across the industry, which is very generous of your time, helping us all be better. And you talk about those things a lot. And I just thought today, maybe we just kind of go back to the bread and butter basics, if that's okay. There's lots of things which over the years, David and I have really enjoyed that you've written. But there's one thing that this year that stood out, and that was, I think, when was it? In June or July, I think. You talked about the need to give your media an advertising health check, which is great. We love that. We love that idea. But you started off grounding it in actually what's the responsibility of the media director or the responsibility of the marketer. And so I thought maybe we could kind of work through some of those health check things, because we like Media Snack to be a kind of practical thing, right? So that others in your position can learn from your experience. my first lead off on that, before we get through, maybe we've got to go through some of these health check principles, is what should a media director be responsible for then? Okay, are you just responsible for the money, or really should you have a wider responsibility?
What are we responsible? Well, I like to think I'm responsible for, and we've been working on it this week, but connecting 1 billion paths to growth. So yes, we're responsible for money and effectiveness and responsibility for what we end up funding. But ultimately, a good media director or good media team, frankly, is one that's very closely linked into the wider business, into finance and marketing, and is driving growth. I mean, every business in the world wants growth, and media is the biggest lever pretty much that any business has. But yeah, I also think that we are talking huge amounts of money, and with great power comes great responsibility. And you're not moving too far away from my hobby horses here, because the reason I wrote that article was part of the conscious advertising network, and really wanting to make people be a bit more conscious about where we spend our money. Though I think more generally, when I first started trying to have a voice and talking in the industry, I had this hashtag digital sense, because I got a bit frustrated that the craziness and noise of kind of digital, which was newer at the time when I first started writing, kind of seemed to cloud all the common sense we had. And actually, by applying a lot of classic laws of reach and frequency and things to digital, you can actually cut through a lot of that crap. But yeah, as a media director, in my business, we're a business that spends well over £1 billion in media, that there's a lot of responsibility to deliver for your business, but also care about where that money goes.
Yeah. And how far does that reach, though? Because that's an interesting part of the discussion, isn't it? I mean, you obviously have to be responsible for where GSK's shareholders' money goes, right? And you don't want anything which could embarrass the company or seems a waste, even a waste of money. But also, you have huge leverage and influence on a lot of the content and the platforms, even perhaps policies of things like a Google and a Facebook and others. It's not just they get a lot of the attention for this stuff. And should we be responsible for the fact that advertising facilitates social media's huge negatives as well as their positives? How far do you ever feel that level of responsibility?
Yeah, I sometimes like to start from the other end, which is that advertising funds all the fantastic things in the world. So it funds news and journalism and the TV shows you like to watch, and Baby Shark that you show your kids to keep them happy and things like that. And there's nothing new about that. Advertising has funded that since pretty much, well, close to the beginning of TV, not quite the beginning of TV, but and through many different models, soap operas and advert breaks and all sorts of things. So I think there's a fantastic upside to that, and advertisers of course have a responsibility. And this year of all years, we can use that positively to push for fair journalism, to push for diverse representation and that side of things. But yeah, of course, our money does also, if we're not careful, go to bad things. It's I think if you're paying for something, you are largely responsible for it. I don't think advertisers need to feel guilty for the bad things in the world, but we definitely need to feel responsible if we're not trying to do something to control our part in those. And if we're not paying as much attention as is possible to where our money goes, what it funds and doesn't fund. And I think in that sort of, I guess, broad brand safety space, you're never going to avoid every possible pitfall. But I think we do have a responsibility to try quite hard, because we live in an astonishing year where some of the biggest challenges we face are awkwardly ad funded. Misinformation about the coronavirus, about elections. Just generally, there's a lot of stuff out there which advertisers don't want to be funding, and also get very little value from, because it's poor quality content. It's not where you want your brands to appear. So with a business and a society hat on, you should pay a lot of attention, and you should have a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
With that responsibility, and this is a topic that I'm kind of fascinated about, particularly with you. I mean, you're very pointed and definitive in the principles that you kind of share in terms of good, positive, progressive behaviors when it comes to certainly the digital supply chain. But yet you are part of an enormous organization that, as you say, spends billions on media. Does that sense of responsibility kind of weigh heavy, because you're ultimately accountable for the way that GSK's digital investment is managed, the transition and the transformation that they're going through. So have you kind of set yourself too high a bar, too high a standard that kind of weighs on your shoulders?
Does it keep me up at night? Occasionally. I like I said, I always caveat it with saying I don't claim that, you know, what we've done at GSK or Diageo, wherever I worked before, was like a foolproof, incredibly high bar by which we would never accidentally appear in front of the wrong thing or fund the wrong thing. But what I've always set my bar is that if that ever happened, we would act fast, and I'd be able to tell you dozens and dozens of things we've done to absolutely minimize that and make the most positive opportunity. And I think that's a fair place to be. Actually, at Diageo, it was literally my job to manage that, to manage the global partnerships, to help them build a trusted marketplace, which is a fantastic solution to this. I wasn't the only one who built it, so I can call it fantastic. At GSK, I've slightly sidestepped that because I have a global digital colleague, was Sandra, now it's Tom, who has that actual burden on their shoulders. And I just get to an agitator on the side telling them, like, we could do more, and are we thinking about this? And the Conscious Advertising Network has this challenge for us, and somebody else has to go into the weeds of it these days. So I've sidestepped some of the responsibility. But it's really important to me. It's one of the first things I talk to my team about when I joined. We work with publicists, and I ask them on a fairly regular basis, like, what have we done differently? What have we moved forwards? But I approach it on a journey basis rather than like setting myself a bar.
I want to tackle. We'll go into some of these, some of your health check principles, and I think we should kind of talk through some of those. The only thing I wanted to just clarify with you was the word digital, which the word digital has been amazing, because that's really been the catalyst for so much change and transformation and all the exciting stuff, frankly, that's been going on in the last 10 years. Is it now a bit of a millstone? Is it really a confusing signpost for people? And how do you view that? Because you've kind of quite intentionally dropped that, I think, that was dropped from your job title, right? So as you just mentioned, so what do we think about the word digital now? What does it mean to you?
I dropped it from my job title. I dropped it from my Digital Sense blog. I started calling Media Sense, but then it turned out there were other companies called that, so that's not ideal. Had to steer clear of that. It's still useful in the sense that it's dangerous in that it still creates a division in strategy and planning and thinking if you're not very careful. But of course, it's still useful. I mean, digital, clearly, in the UK, all TV is digital technically, but digital still has a useful word in differentiating between some of the more traditional channels we used and some of the more, mobile digital channels. And it obviously is specialism, different ways of thinking, especially on the agency side. There is a huge depth of knowledge you need to be a really hands-on kind of buyer, trader, programmatic expert. On the client side, I definitely, my own team, I look for people who very easily span that full media digital remit. Like, as I say, we do have a team of, global digital experts who do go deep on some of that for us. But the sort of the day-to-day media job, I think that term is dangerous if you build silos and have different teams working on things. You want to have people looking right across that who are backed up by experts who know the heart of it. So it's still a useful word, but it's, when we measure things like what percentage of media is digital these days, it's becoming a little bit meaningless because there are so many different things within that.
Yeah. Right, let's get on to some principles. Let's get pragmatic stuff. So that was a nice introduction. Thank you, Jerry, for sharing that, sharing your wisdom on that. So maybe, David, you and I can take these in turn. So brand safety is dead, you say. That's controversial. Actually, we did a piece like a few years ago, which I keep meaning to recirculate, which is where we said brand. There's no such thing as brand safety. What we need is brand care, which is like you just need to kind of give a shit as a marketer. You need to care where your brand sits in the world, and then you don't have any worries about brand safety.
That's the heart of it. And we would, the conscious advertising, I guess we would say brand consciousness, but it's exactly that. And that brand safety, which some people see as kind of a sort of life jacket, lifeboat, was born in the fires of negative headlines. On the front page of the Sunday Times, people were suddenly told they were funding terrorism or paedophilia, a bunch of awful things, and quite rightly, advertisers said, well, God no, let's stop that. And, you know, brand safety existed as this kind of new art of, you know, keyword blocking lists and site lists, and, you know, keep that stuff away from me. And that was the right thing to do. But it wasn't the sort of the solution that was kind of pull the emergency parachute. Now we're a few years later, what's a better approach? Because that stuff creates loads of complications. We leapt from not, I mean, as an industry, not any particular company, from not really caring about this stuff to like being crazily oversensitive towards it, and, you know, whereby the kind of ad breaks you might be willing to appear alongside on TV, you might appear alongside, you know, a horror movie, a really powerful news program, whereas on digital, you know, you wouldn't be a million miles away from that. People, you know, blocking news in its entirety, trying to avoid the word COVID, good luck this year. And you know, there needs to be more nuance, and even brand safety, which is all about like how brand safety is, how do I stop my brand appearing in a newspaper? Whereas, yeah, brand consciousness, or, you know, consumer safety is, how do I stop funding the really bad stuff? It's very different to fund a terrorist organization than to appear near a quality piece of journalism talking about a terrorist incident. You might not want to be in either of them, but they're very different things. And we've seen this year, like, if with too strong brand safety comes some real implications. You know, like if you put COVID on your block list, you defund journalism. Was this a good year to defund journalism? Probably not. And things like minority voices and, you know, horror stories of advertisers who put like lesbian and Muslim on their block lists and just kind of wiped out, you know, not just parts of the internet, but parts of their consumer base. So yeah, go beyond a sort of simple list approach and really start caring where you fund and where you appear.
Yeah. Good. One thing I'll just say, just follow on to that before we move on to the next meaty topic is you know, our advice has been also is tell your partners. So, and if we live, you know, marketers work with more than just media agencies these days, and obviously that responsibility is spread far and wide. But even just working with a media agency, you know, in the contract or the scope of work, make it really clear that actually where your brand appears in the world is important. Because some brands it's not as important, but for some, it's very important for either for their corporate reputation or their luxury goods or whatever it is. You know, the position is. You know, actually specifically call that out in the MSA with the agency, or put it specifically in a scope as something that's going to be tracked. So I think if you make it meaningful, then it matters. And what we've heard is marketers, you know, maybe moan that their agency kind of let the brand exist in all these kind of places. And you say, well, yeah, because you know what you put in your scope of work was buy media as cheap as possible. And then it's therefore it's
exactly that, isn't it? And magically what you put in your scope, and in particular, you know, what you put in your KPIs and that kind of thing, you generally get from your agency. So if you ask for certain brand safety basics, or, you know, we can come on to viewability and other things, you get them, and your agency optimizes to them. And if you don't, and if you tell them all we care about is cost, then don't be surprised if they optimize only for cost, because that's what some clients mean. I think agencies have got much better at having, you know, really, you know, brand safety officers and dedicated teams and approaches they apply across all their clients. But as a client, even if you don't understand this at all, which if you work in media is a bit worrying, but even if you don't, just ask your agency and put the pressure on, and, you know, they'll start dialing up the right knobs for you.
Good. Right.
The next topic, a particular favorite of mine, Jerry, ad fraud.
We should have I think noise, shouldn't we?
As you put it, you should reframe it: organized crime funding. I think is probably a better way of doing it. But I mean, if I was still on the client side and I was responsible for an enormous amount of money, that would be what would be keeping me awake at night. Just burning money, but not just as an exercise in wastage, but in the fact that it goes often to the coffers of unsavory characters. But is there a way of eradicating it completely? I mean, clients you speak to seem to believe that it's an uncomfortable but accepted truth that a proportion of your money will invariably go to ad bot farms and go through ad fraud. What's your point of view on that?
Yeah, and I guess that, I mean, that last statement is why I made that, slightly over the top statement that, well, it's not entirely over the top, that ad fraud does to an extent fund, organized crime and pretty awful things, because we do seem to have landed at a place in an industry where like acceptable ad fraud is, under 1% or under 2%, or a benchmark, and it's fine. It doesn't really impact the overall run of the campaign, etc. Then you take a step back and look at how many billions of pounds are spent on digital marketing globally, and then you're like, well, that's billions of pounds that are going to ad fraud. And ad fraud is, is a very broad term that covers all sorts of things. Some of which are sort of not at all nefarious, mistakes in the system, unknown bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Through to some which are very nefarious, click farms and people creating fake websites and that kind of thing. And yeah, I'm sure some hobbyists do that, but you can also bet that it's one of the biggest industries in the world. Some of the people putting the effort in to become ad fraudsters are not nice people. So that's why it's a slightly different challenge. So if you have a 2% inefficiency on your reporting, which is quite high, but if you have that, well, it's not great, but it's 2%, life goes on. If someone told you that was 2% of your money that you were handing over to organized crime, I think various different stakeholders in your business would want to come and pay more attention. Now, whether you can eradicate or not is a slightly bigger question. It would we could have a whole separate podcast on the media supply chain, the work of PwC and things in recent years, and ISBA, and we were a big part of that. And the fact that it takes huge auditory firms months to try and work out where your money goes is a pretty good indication that that the media ecosystem doesn't work quite right. And I know ISBA and many others are trying to work on improvements to that. And I think that's the starting point. It's not just the fraud; it's that entire waterfall. That entire point. When we spend $1, if you're lucky, half of it, and often a lot less, makes it to a publisher. And to be clear, a lot of that waterfall is adding value. It's helping you with targeting, and it's helping you with understanding where your money's going, and it's totally worth doing it. But as advertisers, we're not always the best at evaluating every step of that and whether it's worth the cost. And then in particular, when we lose track of where that money's going is when fraud comes back in. So I like to think over the coming years, technology, blockchain or something, maybe something less hyped will come and save us. But there are smaller steps you can take. Be very, very cautious. Fraud is much higher when you're buying on like really crazy open tail programmatic inventory without other checks and balances in place. And unsurprisingly, it's much lower when you're buying from a hand-picked group of sites that you track closely. So there are steps everyone can take, and I think steps as an industry we definitely need to take.
And where do you see, and just one final point on this, where do you see the responsibility of that? I mean, obviously it's a collective responsibility, both client and agency partner, but where do you see the real kind of influence coming? Is it going to be from the agencies who are responsible often for activating and trading, or is it going to really come from the client side who demand greater transparency and governance over the money that they spend?
I think the demand has to start with the client, but I think a lot of the change is going to be driven by the agency. At the end of the day, most clients, you may have programmatic experts and things, but you're definitely not as in the weeds with this technology, with buying it, with optimizing it as an agency. That's why you have an agency, to be an expert in that.
Yeah. And
so we can understand where we want to get to and the impetus, and have people who broadly understand this challenge. But you need people who really, really understand the weeds, who, and frankly, although clients are important, agencies work across multiple clients and therefore represent even larger bunches of money and challenge. And I think, ad tech would feel the pain quite quickly if agencies were, unwilling to work with partners who didn't meet certain standards and things. But I'm not pointing the finger specifically at ad tech either, because I don't think any ad tech company builds their platform hoping to allow ad fraud to exist on it. And I think, as I've hinted at, they're against some pretty clever people doing everything they can to outsmart them. So it's not let's all stand around and point at ad tech and say those guys are bad and have let this happen. It's like we all want to solve this, and let's really do it together.
Yep. Very good. Right, we're on to number 3. Okay, we're gonna whiz through the last 4 of these. No, we're not. So third, you said positive investment in quality, and I'd like to specifically ask on that because it's related to ad fraud. I think, and obviously you have thought consciously about, I think, the flow of these.
They all tie together.
They make a lot of logical sense. But related to ad fraud, like Dr. Augustine Fu, who you know well, is kind of, again, very articulate.
He quoted me yesterday in Forbes. I wasn't ready for that, but he did. So there we go.
He named me as well this week. And I'm not sure I am. Height of my career. You know, I mean, and he's been on the show a couple of times, and you know, I love asking him like, how do you get rid of fraud? Because I know what he says, and I love his response, and I want everyone to hear it, which is just buy our media yourself. Like buy media directly from the people that sell it, and then that's the end of the conversation, right? So where should we be on that needle? Because he makes a really good case, and I know he's trying to be provocative, is that, well, there's no point buying through even another third party necessarily. You know, if you want to buy quality and guarantee the quality, then you just go and buy it yourself.
Yeah, I think like many things, there's probably a happy middle ground to be found. When I was at Diageo, this trusted marketplace I mentioned, and it's been talked about a bit externally since, is, you know, it was basically a sort of a site list only approach to media. So they said no to the long tail of programmatic, and they said, we're gonna, you know, audit sites before we put them on our list. It's, you know, reasonably easy audit, like 10 questions, you know, some basic, any semi-decent site should fly through it. Yeah. But it meant they had to be, and it, you know, it cut down their numbers from, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of sites to hundreds of sites. And there were, you know, there's a lot of worries about that. You know, we need thousands of sites to be able to apply loads of data and targeting and things, you know. Oh, our CPMs are notably going up, you know, challenges like that, which are very real. I think on the data one, you know, there's a risk of applying too much data as well, and also you can find some pretty big sites, and certainly if you start to include kind of quality networks, you know, like a Teads or an Unruly or something that's, you know, Brand Advance, which is a diversity network. There, you know, there are networks out there. You get to play, and Diageo, we found that our CPMs went up, so technically our reach did go down in some places, but pretty soon in like MMM and results and brand lift studies and things, you saw that the results were getting better, because surprise, surprise, you're cutting off fraud, but also just lower quality websites that were cheap for a reason, and you kind of had an artificially decreased CPM because whilst you were told you were buying some of this good stuff, it was you know, diluted a bit. Again, you get what you asked for. And the push to positively invest in quality is really to pay a bit more attention to that. Like when we buy TV, I don't think there are many companies that say, I don't care what you buy me, you know, just buy me some TV, it's fine. You know, we say like, I want this, you know, I want this share of networks, I want this share of place in break. You know, there are lots of different quality metrics. For some reason, that goes a little bit out the window. There are some, but they're not always great quality metrics. And it's just a push, well, you know, where you appear, there's loads of research that where you appear matters, like the quality of what you appear next to, the attention that it's getting, the positivity of it. And so, yeah, there are definitely advantages to programmatic media, the finding the right people in the right place at the right time with data. I'm not, you know, like a denier. And I think, you know, Dr. Fu, wonderful as he is, would probably acknowledge that that's not going to completely go away, but certainly you need a lot more controls and limitations, and programmatic was born out of selling off the cheap end of the internet, and it's mutated into a tool that can help you do some good things, but only if you're very careful,
and only if you have the right metrics, right? So that takes us on to the next one: attention, not viewability. I think that was really important, because the metrics by which you will measure performance dictates the behaviors by which that media is going to be activated, right?
Viewability is one of my favorite metrics to discuss, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say, but it is. And so viewability has been seen over the last few years as kind of a great savior of the industry, that it kind of came along and we were buying awful things and being, you know, swindled into stuff that nobody actually saw, and then viewability came along and saved it. And, you know, it probably would struggle to find a big global advertiser who doesn't have a sort of, I don't know, at least MRC standard bare minimum viewability threshold that they apply across everything, and, you know, looks green in a tracking dashboard. But viewability is a complicated beast. And even people have lots of different thoughts about, oh, it should be longer, it should be completed views, it should be 100%. But the heart of viewability is we want to track whether an advert had an actual chance of being seen by a human being. Which for me, actually, I quite think, an MRC, quite a short view, that's fine. They had a chance of being seen. It's sort of a separate question. Was it seen for long enough? Was it seen for enough? Did people stick with your content? That's a very important thing to measure, but it's not the same thing as was it seen. And you also have to factor in who you're trying to cut out. So as a metric, viewability was created to stop us buying the worst part of the internet. Did the worst part of the internet just give up and say, oh, well, that's a shame, I can't sell any impressions anymore? No, they invented the plastic surgery slideshow, which is like a web page designed to have 100% viewability, like the worst user experience you can imagine, but 100% viewable, like a terrible place for your advert to be. Really low quality, just terrible, 100% viewable. Whereas, front page of the wallstreetjournal.com probably has quite poor viewability because people click and they scroll down. Social networks famously very poor viewability. Does that mean they're terrible places, or does it mean that you're just appearing in a different space? And attention, whilst imperfect, tries to tie some of those pieces together and be like, well, I'm not saying viewability isn't important. You still need a sort of baseline metric to check that I'm in the game, but you also want to understand, well, who really is paying attention to this? How long are they watching for? What am I competing for on the screen? How much of their attention do I have? And then you start to get into a bit more a grown-up quality measure, more aligned with, place in break network, get in TV. Whereas viewability is an easily gamed metric, which isn't being gamed by the side you want it to be gamed by. And actually, my always question is, what do you want? Like, do advertisers really want it so that their adverts, you're scrolling down a news article and your advert, there are formats like this that like force you to stop and watch a 30-second video. Okay, it would be viewable, but your advert would also be annoying every single person who's scrolling.
True.
Right, let's move on. Number 5, diversity. But we're talking here about you call it diversity of media as well as content. And again, this is something that we've discussed a little bit. And your partner in crime, if we call her that, Belinda Smith, who's the kind of joint diversity ambassador with WFA. Again, on previous episode, we'll link to it here. We talked a lot about kind of through some of these things, and I think she suggested this really interesting way of thinking about it, which is the way that now we talk more to clients like this. Is marketers have responsibilities in 3 areas. They probably have responsibilities in lots of areas, but when it comes to diversity, it can oversimplify and think about them in 3 areas. One is, representing the world, so therefore their content. So that's, I think you referenced it earlier, just making sure that your ads show society and consumers in a reasonable way. Secondly, then you have your own internal team. So if you're a CMO, you want your team to be reflective, at the very least reflective of your consumer base, if not reflective of society broadly, and therefore you should of course be thinking to have a diverse team. And then also CMOs are responsible, or marketers are responsible then for a whole bunch of supplier contracts, and you can potentially use your influence on your suppliers. So in your case, you have a media agency or you have an ad agency, and that's a great discussion that's going on at the moment, trying to encourage greater diversity through the agency industry, with marketers kind of applying pressure on that. That's good. We'll link to that episode because I think Belinda did far better than I. Just wasted 1 minute trying to do. So tell us about diversity of media then. Why is that important? Also, why can't we just throw it all into banner ads? What's wrong with that?
Well, I'll front into the slight irony of 3 white men talking about diversity, but actually, I think honestly, that's really important. I think, white men in our industry, ultimately in a lot of senior positions, we need them leaning into this conversation. It's awesome that we're having it today. And, I'm the Robin to Belinda's Batman. She's a phenomenal driving force in this space and has helped set up this WFA task force, which is 20-30 marketers from big companies, some of us in media, most of them in the creative side. really trying to say, and not reinvent the wheel. There's lots of good initiatives out there, Unstereotype Alliance and other bits and pieces. How do we get more people paying attention to this stuff, which, as you say, starts with kind of casual representation? Do we at least try and reflect positively the actual consumers buying our products? And some brands take it much further into really purposeful stories and spaces like that. But yeah, the media the creative gets a lot of attention. The internal teams rightly get a lot of attention, and frankly, if you get the internal team right, you get the external one right as well. But there are other parts of marketing that sometimes get forgotten. I think insights is an interesting one where sometimes it all goes wrong at the very start. If you have very generic insights and pen portraits that eradicate the nuance in your consumers, it's no surprise by the end you're a bit generic. But media is a really, really key one. We've touched on many of the points why along the way, but the problem that brand safety, a great thing in theory, helping us stop hate speech against minorities, clearly a good thing. Accidentally blocking all content that talks to those minorities, not a good thing. Vice said something a couple of years ago, like up to 75% or something of advertisers were blocking their LGBT content. And that meant they, as an editorial team, they were like, well, we can't write positive stories about the LGBT community because no one will pay us for them. And Vice, they still did, but they raised that point. And if you were sort of a dedicated publisher serving the LGBT or the Muslim, all sorts of different communities, and advertisers were just cutting you out of their buys by, very bad use of keywords, well, that is crushing diversity. So yes, stop the hate speech, but don't stop the positive voices. And then beyond that, and again, it's aligned with, deliberately invest in quality, but deliberately invest in diverse voices. As an advertiser, our job is literally to understand our consumers and to speak and be relevant to as many of them as possible. We call them minorities, but minorities add up to quite a large group of people. Audiences that perhaps your competitors aren't doing such a good job of talking to. So absolutely, work with Black-owned and focused media, work with LGBTQ titles deliberately, and whether that's like just ensuring they're on your site list so that some of your media runs there, job done. But even more so, do partnerships with them, do content with them. They understand the audience much better than probably you do. You can create fantastic, and we've done it in the UK this year. We did 2 partnerships with Gay Times. One was Sensodyne. It was very much just casual representation, just with a much more diverse, colourful cast. And we did a piece with Volt Volpara in our pain gel, which was much more purposeful. It was funding and supporting LGBT organisations as they coped with the sports groups, as they coped with COVID. But we worked directly with Gay Times. It wasn't a huge part of our media mix, but I know to them it was a big boost. I'm not saying that in a patronising way. They're smaller organisations, and without advertisers funding them, they will struggle and they will vanish. So if you care about diversity and representation and what you put on screen, think about how you fund it, through your media as well. And it's not just to fund it, because you want to appear relevantly to those audiences. And yes, minority voices do watch mainstream content, but they also appreciate being spoken to in their spaces positively where they feel represented.
Yeah. Good. I know we've got some questions, but I want to just get on to the next one if we can before you chip in with some.
I've actually got a whole bunch of comments, which maybe we'll come to the end.
Okay, but it's around the dynamic between data and context, Jerry, because obviously, the guiding principle is that data generates insights that informs content and media kind of execution. But you kind of challenge that, don't you? You want to bring in some more contextual understanding, as you were talking about in terms of your previous principle. So what do you mean about, data first and not context last?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately the underlying principle of our industry is find the most complicated way to do the simplest things. So it's, let's say you wanted to target a football fan, and there you are, you're buying data of, who went to Anfield in the last 2 weeks, and who's purchased football boots on Amazon. And frankly, you could just run advertising on the football news websites, of the main newspapers in your country, and you would be 100% guaranteed not only to be reaching football fans, but also to be reaching football fans whilst they're thinking about football. Because you can be a football fan and have been to a football stadium, but you're in the middle of doing something completely different. And so an advert that's kind of cleverly using, dynamic creative with a mention of football to draw you in may not feel that relevant to you. That isn't to say that, data and targeting isn't an important lever in the marketing industry. It's just start by thinking, is there a simpler way? Context, that kind of broad opportunity. In particular, I think, and this is what Dr. Fu quoted me on, I just think that over targeting is a real issue in the marketing industry, that like digital has been sold in for its kind of hyper targeting, and sure, you can show better conversion rates and higher ROI if you speak to a customer who's like a centimeter away from buying your product already. But if you focus all your efforts on that, and Binet and Field have shown a decline in advertising effectiveness over the last decade, as we have, and so I have a simple phrase, which is use data to be relevant to more people rather than visible to fewer. So when I talk to my team and my agency and people about let's apply more data to our marketing, I think we should. Data's fantastic. For some weird reason, we jump to the most complicated thing, and you get pitched like, well, we've got this crazy like DCO idea where we can do this, and I was like, well, okay, but have we started by using data much more broadly to identify like the channels and the mix, and have we used it to explore broad interest areas? So it might be that you, like for Corsadil, one of our toothpastes, mouthwashes, we used it to identify the fact that gaming was a really interesting audience for us, because we were trying to reach a younger audience. But we didn't then just like say, okay, let's take our normal Corsadil toothpaste advert and target it at gamers all over the internet, because that would have been weird, but possible. We worked with Twitch, and so we identified a need, and then we worked across their entire audience, and we actually created a bespoke campaign that talked to gaming and was really quite fun. But it wasn't about like hyper targeting those people. And there obviously are times when down the funnel you want to hyper target and chase people up and follow them up, but a lot of the time, certainly if you've ticked sort of 10 boxes of data or something on your targeting, you probably want to untick half of those, and you'll find that your campaign will ultimately work better, and certainly in the long run grow your brand more.
Yeah, well said.
Very good. Right, we're on number 7. We made it. And I think you say like you intentionally left this last because it's the number 7. And by the way, we'll link to these principles down below. And what I should point out is that your blog post, which is awesome, has some really clear actions which we're kind of exploring today. So appreciate that. But measure what really matters. This is just time and time again. Dave and I have experienced over the last kind of 10 years working with advertisers around the world. The amount of things that come back to missing KPIs or just not being able to actually articulate exactly what's important. And we've referenced it through the previous 6 things. I think it's just the most consistent thing is actually, what do we want media dollars to do? What do we want our agency partners to do? What do we need our teams to do? How have you approached that? Then what's the kind of cherry on the cake for you when it comes to measurement?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, isn't it? That baffles the great minds of the industry. So I definitely can't claim to have solved it. But if you cut me, I sort of bleed marketing science, and I'm very kind of how brands grow, Binet and Sharp, and that kind of thing. And I think that that brings a lot of challenges to what we do in data. I think actually one of the simplest things that has misled our industry over the last decade is that this simple idea of what's easy to measure is often not that useful, and what's really useful is still quite hard to measure, and that unfortunately remains true in the digital space. So it's quite hard to measure the impact of a TV ad or an outdoor ad. Well, in a way it's easy because you see the impact on your sales, but it can be hard to get into that nuance. And then digital came along and everyone said, well, it's super easy because I can see who clicks on it, I can see who engages with it, job done. But those KPIs, I think many of us know, are very short term. Famously on Facebook, you can do a correlation of engagement rates for campaigns and business and brand results, and there is no correlation. Spoiler alert: if you work in social media and think engagement's a key KPI, I'd really like to challenge you on that. It's not. Engagement is a metric of how clickable your ad is. So I could make a toothpaste ad that was just a picture of cute puppies, and I would get really high engagement, but I can pretty much guarantee you I wouldn't sell any more toothpaste. Or I could make this cool gaming advert that showed computer game versions of people fighting to keep their breath clean. was a bit bonkers. You can find it later. And it probably it will definitely get much lower engagement. And actually, as much as it gets engagement, it will probably be passive. People will watch it through to the end. They won't feel a need to like, comment, or share. They'll move on with their life. But hey, they'll know our brand exists. They might slightly care it exists.
Sounds like an
advert. Yeah, like an advert. And so, I mean, the IAB did quite a funny campaign called like "Don't be a clickhead," which is that, you know, marketers just we get hooked up to these you know, into our veins. One of the things, when I was working with Jerry D'Angelo back in the Mondelez days, we were, you know, I was leading social media for the region and for Europe, and we pushed this idea of like, you know, bringing these big screens that showed the social content we had into the lobby of several of our, you know, biggest offices, so that people saw the fantastic work we were doing in social. And then almost by default, the team building those ranked them by engagement, and everyone started talking about which was the most engagement. We actually just had to remove that completely, because it became this weird competition between brands to drive up the most engagement, when actually much more important was, you know, how many people are seeing this, you know, how many people, and these days, like passive engagement, like how many people bothered to watch your advert the whole way through, you know, that was much more important. But because engagement is a very easy to measure number, it's very easy to optimize to, it's very easy to put in KPIs, it inevitably comes back to haunt you. But that was a very long answer. To the simple answer is I often look to a lot of more traditional ways of measuring even the more digital stuff. So, you know, love them or hate them, things like econometric models can be quite good. Sort of brand tracking in particular, I think, is really important, because it shows you a long-term view as well as a short-term view. And even in the digital space, things like Google Consumer Survey and stuff like that, which is, you know, more in that brand tracking space. Or if you must use digital KPIs, and the difficulty is if you tell everyone that all digital KPIs are useless, they're like, well, you know, what do we do? So if you must use some, I generally find that the slightly more passive ones are better, because the majority of your consumers are passive. They're, you know, absorbing your adverts just like they do on the TV. If you optimize to the clickers and the active people, you're optimizing to a weird skewed set. So instead, optimize to things like view through rate, dwell time. Obviously, if you have conversion in your business, that's a different story. But for like a brand advertiser, we rarely do.
Yeah.
Good advice.
Very good. Very
practical. Good. Excellent, Jerry.
You know, our good intentions to keep these live episodes kind of, you know, 30, 40 minutes. However, I'm loath to ask a follow-up, but I want to ask it because it's really important, I think. And, you know, maybe it's a yes/no answer, maybe it's not. But in a post-cookie world, I think
it's not a yes/no answer, is it?
I can hear myself saying like, no. But over the years, a lot of marketers have, a lot of different marketing organizations have relied on MMM, right? And they've had these kind of contracts and they do MMM. And then there's always been these naysayers, increasingly noise over the last maybe 10 years of people saying MMM, it's so clumsy, it's so slow, it doesn't really tell us anything. But then, you know, we're hearing increasingly people saying, the hypothesis in a post-cookie world, actually, we're going to be more reliant on, and lots of these kind of things, we'll be relying a lot more on kind of context and, you know, traditional kind of media thinking, and actually MMM's value is going to increase. Have you heard, is that kind of conversations that you're having or you've heard? Is that what we should be encouraging marketers to fall in love with MMM again?
Yes.
Great.
I mean, but no, I think MMM is changing. You know, econometric modeling is changing a lot as an industry. You can do it faster. You can do it that better reflects digital, though, you know, it's far from perfect. And even if it was perfect, it would be telling you a short-term ROI for most of the time, which is only part of the story. And it doesn't necessarily tell you how things interact and work together. But yeah, I think, interestingly enough, the cookie-less future we await, which I think we're still yet to see just how much impact that's going to have, because, you know, ad tech is scrambling to find workarounds, and we may find for the most part we can still do a lot of what we did before. But actually, slightly controversially, I often find that the things that it will stop us doing are things that perhaps we didn't need to do in the first place, like hyper-targeting, chasing people around the internet. Not a great user experience. It's not a great way of growing your brand. If the law stops us doing that, maybe the law is doing its job. But you know, there will still be ways of doing these things. Hopefully, ways that are good and fair for consumers, that, you know, use data for good. Because there are, you know, as a consumer, I don't want to be bombarded by irrelevant ads. So I'm, you know, happy for data to be used for good. But yeah, I think more traditional forms of research will become more important, partly because of cookieless future, but partly because digital is maturing to play by the same rules as other media types, and going to your kind of CFO and telling him, here's my engagement rate from Facebook, is never going to bring you the same weight as here's my econometric modeling telling me what this drives for your business.
Good. Yeah. I should point out CFOs can be female as well there, Jerry. Just
apologies. Mine is not. I was visualizing the conversations I have, but of course they can.
we tripped up Jerry.
On the diversity topic, absolutely tripped up all the time. I've said some really awkward things. I've been challenged. My good friend of mine, Chris Kenner, had to tell me I said something kind of offensive on a diversity panel once before, but he wasn't really offended because I was, doing it with the right heart, with the right mind. But yes, a good call out.
And on that note, Tom,
lots of I just guests towards the end of the show. It's kind of spicy. We've had loads of comments. I'll just quickly kind of run through some of them. I know we've run kind of on here. So a few good positive, I think generally positive comments generally about the jumper. That's good.
Show more.
Also, adult fans of Lego are actually called adult fans of Lego, AFOL, for somebody's confirmed.
I knew as I was saying it, adult fans of Lego were called something. I just can't remember what it was. I was so close.
That's it. Nadia, maybe you can pull up Donna's comment as well, because I think this
Donna
captures a lot of sentiment as well. And we should, thank you for your leadership, because we acknowledged it in the introduction, but the amount of energy that you give to the industry is phenomenal, and we're all grateful for that. And today's just another demonstration of how much good stuff you've got to say on this. So Donna's asking, I mean, again, it's a big question with not really a yes or no answer, but are there kind of some simple things, if they are simple, or can we simplify the steps that the industry needs to take?
Step one is be more Donna. So Donna is one of the most inspirational people I've had the pleasure of working a little bit near. We did some Mondelez pitching together back in the day, and if you get her after a long day to tell her what she's doing at the weekend, it's usually something. I'm stereotyping. It's some sort of incredible orphanage project she supports and does fantastic things. So I think as individuals, we can all do crazy stuff above and beyond to change the industry. So be more Donna / think about what you personally can do in your life, and it doesn't have to be crazy volunteering. It can be in meetings, in conversations, in everyday micro moments. What can you personally do to improve diversity? Sometimes you have active decisions, who you hire, who you employ, who you work with, but even much smaller things, like if you're on a Zoom call these days and you notice there are certain people inclined less likely to speak, and it's a bunch of loud white men, maybe not, white men are not bad, talking all the time, bring them into the conversation. I think that don't start from scratch. There's lots of good guides out there, like the WFA. I helped input into this guide, the WFA, what it's called, brand guide, marketer's guide to diversity and inclusion. Loads of interesting resources out there. And the third one I think is listen and just pay more attention to the diverse people in your organization. Both make sure those voices are heard, but I think this year's been a really important one for companies to listen, especially to some of the Black voices in their business, some of the other minorities. And I fully recognize that some of those people are quite tired of having to explain themselves to everyone else. But the good news is so many of those people have written stuff and done podcasts, and it's out there. So you don't necessarily have to go and, ask a minority what they feel. Do some research, listen to some podcasts. So yeah, think about the micro things you can do in your day. Look at the fantastic resources that are out there, and listen and pay attention. But it also depends a bit where you work in marketing. Like wherever you work in marketing, there are probably unconscious biases in your team, in insights, in creative and media, and we all just need to chip away at them.
Good, Jerry. Thank you so much. As we said at the beginning, I mean, there's so much that your peers and anyone in those kind of roles, in those influential media leadership roles, can learn from you, and the simple way that you kind of structure out a framework just to think. So we'll link to some of your posts to kind of the really kind of practical things, because they're very helpful. We encourage everybody to kind of work through these and think about your own health check. Okay. I think we're kind of running out of internet bandwidth, I think, at some point. Jerry,
thank you, Jerry. It was really good.
having me for this 30-minute chat.
It's never going to be that. Cool.
He's gone. Disappeared.
Good.
Good.
Thank you, Jerry.
Epic.
Thank you to everybody who left comments. We're never going to have time to kind of get through all of those, but some really good questions for follow-up. You can add them in below the episode, and I'm sure either between us and Jerry will reply. That's your media snack for this week. Join us next week for more great guests. Thank you for watching.
See you next time.